I want to introduce you today to ontological arguments. Ontological arguments are arguments for the existence of God that are based purely upon the idea of God. In terms of arguments that we cover, I think these are in some way the most fascinating of the arguments. Because at first glance, frankly, it seems really silly. Like really silly. And yet, when you try to find out what's wrong with it, it's really hard to find out what's wrong with it. And these ontological arguments have fascinated philosophers for hundreds, over 1,000, in fact, years, because of their interesting logical puzzle. So the key idea basically is this: the definition of God as some sort of kind of all-powerful, all-knowing being, basically perfect, means that he must exist. That fundamentally, although obviously that's quite simplistic, but that fundamentally is it. The definition of God means that God must exist really, like in the real world, not some sort of fantasy thing, not in your mind, but in reality. Why is that? What's this link between the one and the other? Well, the link is that God is perfect, and it's more perfect to exist than not to exist. So if you understand his definition, you have to define him as existing. Let's start with some definitions. Not of God, just of, general things. These are ontological arguments are a priori and deductive. An a priori argument, or an a priori piece of knowledge, is knowledge gained. Can you remember? Oh, I can't remember how to spell knowledge, clearly. Knowledge. It wouldn't be a tutorial if I didn't misspell at least one word, would it? Knowledge gained through any idea? Last chance. Reason. So the whole argument is a priori. This is one of the big differences, really, between the ontological arguments and, say, the cosmological and teleological arguments. Cosmological and teleological arguments require a posteriori knowledge. They require us to go into the world and see things and draw conclusions from the things that we see. Ontological arguments have been a favourite of philosophers because you don't need to leave your armchair. It's just about thought. And not only is it a priori, it's also deductive. Deductive is a form of argument where if the premises are true, do you remember what a premise is? It's just a stage in the reasoning. It's a statement. So if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true, must be correct. There's no probabilistic reasoning going on here. It's for sure. Okay. So if the premises are correct and the logic works, then the conclusion must be true. And those premises are purely gained through reason. So everything, all arguments about this, are purely rational. And that's one of the things that makes this really interesting. Now, there are other forms of deductive reasoning which you can do just sat down, looking a little bit melancholy. For instance, mathematics is an example of deductive a priori reasoning. Another example would be Descartes' claim, "I think, therefore I am." The mere fact that I am thinking means that I must exist. So this is an example from philosophy. This is an example from another discipline altogether. My point is that a priori deductive reasoning does exist and is valid in study. So we can't say when we look at this argument, oh, this is just a silly argument based upon ideas. It's just playing with ideas, because it's not. It's more than that. It is using reason to prove a truth, just like you use reason to prove that 2 + 2 = 4, or that you exist because you have thoughts. Now, the first proponent of this was St. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived about 1,000 years ago, and his aim was to show that atheism being the belief that God doesn't exist, is self-contradictory. What do we mean by self-contradictory? Well, a self-contradictory statement or position is one that makes itself false. So all bachelors are unmarried men is self-contradictory. Anselm thinks atheism is self-contradictory because the atheist has the definition of God in their mind and a denial that God exists. That's the definition of an atheist. But Anselm thinks that the definition of God means that God must exist. So it is self-contradictory, he thinks, to be an atheist. An interesting argument. This was then kind of criticised by especially a monk called Gornillo, and really only resurfaced in the Enlightenment period with a philosopher called René Descartes. Now, Descartes used the ontological argument differently, although he used it in a very similar form to Anselm's, only kind of tweaking at the edges. His aim was to prove that a perfect God exists so that he can gain more knowledge. Remember, Descartes is the one who said, I think, therefore I am. He's put himself in this position of doubting everything. And Descartes thinks, if I doubt everything, I doubt the existence of the external world, how am I going to get out of that? Well, I can't use a posteriori reasoning. I can only use a priori reasoning. So he proves the existence of himself, and then he proves, or thinks he does, proves the existence of God. And if God exists, then he thinks, well, God is all good. He's not going to allow me to be in this much doubt, so I can then start exploring the world again. I can start believing in the existence of the world. So external world is more likely. So they both have kind of different aims. Descartes uses the ontological argument because it's the thing at his disposal in his epistemological project, which means an epistemological project is a project on knowledge, right? Whereas Anselm is simply concerned with showing that atheism is self-contradictory. Enough preamble. Enough introductions. Let's turn now to the argument itself. Let's see it in its basic form, stage by stage. Remember, this is an a priori argument, so it can all be done by this guy sat here on his chair. His first thought is just of the definition of God, and we might define God in a whole range of ways. If we are, say, Anselm, we might say that he is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. What that means is he is a being than which nothing greater can be thought. If I can think of a greater being, if I can think of a being with better characteristics, then that is God. So for Anselm, and that is a quote, for Anselm, it is simply a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And Anselm would say, I know that's true because I have it in my mind, and that's all that I need. Descartes says he is simply something that is perfect, the perfect being, with every possible perfection. So that's Descartes' definition. Descartes' definition is significantly simpler than Anselm's, and by the way, I think benefits from one particular characteristic, which is that in Anselm's, it's all about what you can conceive, what you can think of. Maybe you can't think of the greatest possible being, you can only think of something that you are capable of conceiving of. Whereas Descartes says, no, he's just perfect. Another definition in the modern era, because it goes beyond Descartes to the modern era, might be he is maximally great. Okay. So maximally great is even simpler than perfection, because perfect implies a limit, implies a knowable top, whereas maximally great doesn't imply a knowable top. This is Plantinga's definition, and Plantinga is a modern American philosopher. Now, one of the things that these all have in common is this: the definition of God means that God must have all perfections, all great-making qualities. And that is known purely by definition. We're not making a claim about the world, we're merely, at this point, making a claim about an idea. So, if you're Anselm, you're saying, well, if I could conceive of something greater, then that's the thing. So whatever is greatest is the thing he has. If he's perfect, well, he must have every perfection, otherwise he's not perfect. And if he's maximally great, he must have every maximal quality, every perfection. That's the first stage. Now, the second stage of the argument is to talk about existence. And the basic claim here is, if we conceive of two things, an apple that is just a thought and an apple in reality, we can see that just numerically speaking, an apple in reality is better than an apple in your head. Existence is the second claim. Existence is greater or more perfect than non-existence. Well, now let's apply this principle to the definition of God, to the concept of God. If existence is better than non-existence, and God must have all great-making qualities, must have everything that makes him perfect, then it is greater for God to exist than not to exist. It is greater for God to exist than not. Now we have the full argument. God must have all perfections. Existence is more perfect than non-existence. So God must, if he's going to be perfect, have existence. And the conclusion then, pretty obviously, is that God exists. Not just in thought, but in the real world. Because it is greater to exist in thought than in... it is greater to exist in the real world than merely in thought. So God exists in the world, in reality. And that is the ontological argument.